Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this month's installment of Epic Insight. I'm Brian Lenz, Director of Sales and Strategic Partnerships here at Epic Retirement Plan Services, and I'll be your host and moderator for today's session, Saving for Healthcare, Is There a Cure-All Solution? I'm sure you've all seen the press and had many conversations about HSAs, for example, in the marketplace, but we found that actually doing something with this as part of your advisory practice is a concept that's still very much in its infancy. So joining us today to explore how you as advisors can use healthcare to differentiate yourselves from your competitors is Patrick Delaney, Vice President of Retirement Insights with Rowe Price. Patrick is a Retirement Insights leader and a Vice President of Rowe Price Investment Services. And in his current role, he plays a key part in developing the firm's point of view and position on major topics and issues that impact the retirement plan industry, including plan design, demographic trends, sponsor and participant target date utilization, investment selection, and financial wellness. He's also a frequent speaker at client and industry events, including our annual Epic Elevate conference. As a quick reminder, if you do have any questions, please feel free to enter those in the questions panel on the GoToWebinar pane there, and I'll throw those at Patrick at the end of the call. Without further ado, Patrick, take it away.
Thank you very much, Brian. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for taking a little bit of your day to talk to us and learn a little bit more about healthcare savings and the expenses that a lot of folks are seeing they're going to be faced with in retirement. And as Brian kind of alluded to, it's one of the more popular topics in the national debate, but it has really rocketed to prominence within the employee benefits and retirement space over the past couple of years because as these costs seem to escalate, both employers and employees' ears are perking up about this. I mean, employers have a finite amount of benefits dollars that they've got to allocate across the organization, and they've got this red alarm going off, and these healthcare insurance expenses that keep going up. And so they're grappling with how they can at least temper or mitigate the rising costs associated with insuring their employees. And then on the employee side, there's a number of studies that have come out over the past couple of years that are hanging a six-figure price tag on healthcare expenses in retirement, and that's a lot of them say is for a healthy 65-year-old couple retiring today. So you've got a lot of interest about this, and if you strip away kind of the politics and the economics and the financial aspects about it, it's important. It's going to stay an important topic because just in general, I don't think people are big fans of dying. People aren't big fans of death, and that's all. What healthcare is trying to prolong your life, and the ways that we're looking to do that. I mean, the innovations that are coming forth in terms of biomedical engineering and printing 3D limbs and less invasive surgeries and new cancer treatments are all very expensive, and they also ensure that life expectancy is going to continue to rise. Life expectancy in the U.S. in 1900 was 49 years of age. In 1950, that jumped to 68, and right now we're hovering at right about 68. We're hovering right around 80 years of age. So there's this huge emotional component that is related to healthcare expenses as well. And trying to prepare for the unpredictable is a tough situation, especially for a lot of financial professionals to be in. And we're left to try to make sense of this. How are individuals going to solve healthcare expenses in retirement? And so what we're going to talk about today is a quick overview of the healthcare landscape. We're going to talk about ways to save and is there a cure-all solution? And really we want to get into what does this mean for you? We certainly are not going to advocate that you all of a sudden become a healthcare expert. We know that you are stretched thin as it is in terms of the volume of work that you have to do to satisfy your clients, to run your business and run your practice on a week-to-week basis. So we don't advocate that you become a healthcare expert, but we do want to give you enough information that you can become credible and conversant on the topic. I like to say, if you're asked to play a healthcare expert on television, hopefully you have enough information in order to be able to do that with some respect. So we take a look at the healthcare landscape, and the first place we want to start is kind of this broad brush stroke of somebody's state of financial wellness. And the reason that we start here is because since the inception of the 401k, we've been advocating that participants save between 10 and 15% every single year in order to maintain their standard of living over a 30-year retirement. And if we're beating that drum, and yet 64% of folks say that finances are the largest source of stress in their lives, or 63% can't even cover a new set of brakes of the refrigerator going up without dipping into some sort of a savings account or putting it on a credit card, then how successful are we going to be at getting these folks to save 10 or 15% every single year for retirement? So when we talk about something like financial wellness, which is helping folks master the basics, financial wellness is kind of like clearing out the clutter of your house, or getting rid of all the clutter in your house. My wife and I actually just a couple weeks ago had our first floor repainted, and we had crown molding put in. And we have two daughters that are 10 and 7. We're actually taking them to Disney tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. But in order to be able to get ready for the painters and the carpenters to come in, we had to get rid of a lot of the clutter that has accumulated around our house. But once we did that, all of a sudden it freed us up to focus on so many other higher priority initiatives around our house. And it's kind of what financial wellness is to an individual who's trying to save. Like, once you get rid of the baggage that's associated with student loan repayments or credit card debt, and you can stick to a budget and you can save $1,000 or $2,000 in an emergency, all of a sudden those people become a lot better retirement savers. Or by extension, they become a lot better at saving for one of the biggest expenses they'll face in retirement, which is healthcare expenses. So that's why we start with this broad brush stroke in terms of what a snapshot of somebody's average financial picture looks like. And if you want to focus it a little bit more on retirement at this point, here are people's top 5 fears, according to a PricewaterhouseCoopers survey from last year. And you look at fears number 2 and 3, health issues and healthcare costs. You could argue pretty credibly, I think, that they directly or indirectly impact and influence fears 1, 4, and 5. And you talk about healthcare expenses in the same conversation as financial wellness. I mean, all of these things are very interrelated. If you have health issues, if you have difficulty covering healthcare costs, then really that is going to affect your ability to meet monthly expenses or maintain your standard of living and God forbid, run out of money in retirement. So if you are out there talking to plan sponsors or individuals about financial wellness, you can tie healthcare expenses and saving for them on the back end of that conversation. It's not two disparate things. It's two parts of the same conversation. If you get your financial house in order, then you become a lot better at saving for retirement and things like healthcare expenses. So right here we see that fears 2 and 3 very prevalent in terms of what people are scared of in retirement. And that dovetails into this, because what they'll face, that health goods and services, you can see, is 33% of the retirement income pie, if you will, that people will face. Now, this is from a Credit Suisse study a couple of years ago. If you look at the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics, it puts that health goods and services figure at roughly 18 to 22%. But the point is, and I think this is really what scares a lot of folks, is healthcare expenses don't start out being the greatest expense that people face in retirement, but they almost always end up there. And it's one of the only expenses that continues to increase when everything else either stays steady or starts to decline a little bit as people age. And the unfortunate part, especially for financial professionals that are seeking to help folks, is that if somebody suffers what they call a black swan event, which is an accident, a catastrophic fall, dementia, something like that, these expenses don't rise predictably or incrementally. They can rise drastically and exponentially, and it is very unpredictable. So it's something that you try to prepare for, because it does in some form or fashion become the greatest expense that people face in retirement. And you look at the numbers here. Here are the realities for folks who are paying for Medicare and Medigap today. And you look at the individual, 46.78, the couple is 93.55. You go, okay, well, let's divide those by 12. I'm going to carry the 1. You go, that's not too bad, actually, if you break it down between an individual and a couple over 12 months. And in a way, that's not the point of this. And I want you to focus on that Part B row, which is $134 per person per month. When Medicare Part B was introduced in 1967, that $134 was $3. And according to Medicare's own board of trustees, between 2019 and 2026, that is going to rise to $190. That's a 42% increase, which is a 5.1% compounded annual growth rate. And the point I'm trying to make here is that these expenses are rising at a rate sometimes 2 to 3 times that of inflation. And so the purchasing power, the cost of Medicare versus income and what people have saved is increasing a lot faster than inflation is. Now, this is at an individual level. Let's take a look at what employers are paying per employee, and this is among large employers. Here are 4 of the most popular health insurance plans that organizations offer their employees. And you can see that the consumer-driven health plan, which is HSA eligible, the second from the right, is 22% less than your traditional PPO all the way on the left-hand side. Now, most employers will make contributions to an HSA on behalf of the employee. Even when you factor those employer contributions in, the HSA eligible consumer-driven plan is still 22% less than a traditional PPO. And for everybody who's involved in helping plan sponsors and participants, the bottom bullet on this slide is the real, this is the statistic I'd want you to pay attention to, that 75% of employers now view HSAs as part of a retirement benefit strategy. Look at that wording there. They didn't say a health insurance strategy. They didn't say an employee benefit strategy. They said a retirement benefit strategy. That has implications for everybody that has some book of business within the retirement space and in helping plan sponsors. And we'll come back to that in a little bit and talk about ways that we can address that statistic there. So that's a brief overview of the retirement landscape. Let's take a look now at ways that people can save for future healthcare expenses. And I'm going to caveat this by saying this is the 3 ways that we'll discuss and compare are 3 ways that most employees have available to them in the accumulation phase of their careers. Do I think that insurance products, variable annuities, and so forth are a very viable way to help mitigate future healthcare expenses? Absolutely. To some folks in retirement, does taking a reverse mortgage help to stem costs or mitigate costs associated with healthcare? Absolutely. But we're talking about most employees' common savings vehicles and in the accumulation phase of their career. And these are the 3 that we'll compare and contrast here. That most people have either pre-tax or Roth contributions available through an employer-sponsored plan or through an individual retirement account. And now we've got this the prevalence and proliferation of health savings accounts that are flooding the market, and we'll look at some trends there. And contrary to what I think a lot of other financial services and certainly HSA providers will say, we don't think that HSAs are a silver bullet. Do we think that they are good for specific demographics of people? 100%. But usually, for most people, a combination of answers is usually, or a combination of savings accounts is the right answer, as opposed to one of these specifically or exclusively at the cost of the other 2. And if you want to compare and contrast them a little further here, and I don't want to get bogged down in every single row and column on this chart, we have follow-up materials that we will make available that you can use with clients that outline the exact account features and benefits on this chart. But I do want to say, when you bump up pre-tax versus Roth versus HSAs against each other, and you can see the different account features on the left-hand side in gray, the blue cells indicate when one savings vehicle has a relative advantage over the other one or other 2. And the point is not to count up all the blue cells and see which one wins. It's to demonstrate that all of these have advantages and disadvantages over the other ones. And if you want to call a few out, we know, I think, one of the biggest things that the media highlights or emphasizes is that HSAs have a triple tax advantage. The money goes in tax deferred, the earnings grow tax free, and if you withdraw the money for qualified medical expenses, you withdraw everything tax free. So there really is no other triple tax advantage savings vehicle available to people today. And so that is certainly worth noting and remarking. Now, if you look at the early distribution penalty, which is the 3rd row there, you can see that it's only a 10% penalty for early withdrawal from pre-tax and Roth accounts. But for HSAs, it's a 20% penalty. and the age of early distribution for HSAs is 65, not 59.5 as it is with pre-tax and Roth contributions from, let's say, a 401k. And so if you are using the money for something other than qualified medical expenses out of an HSA prior to age 65, you're getting hit with a whopper of ordinary income taxes plus a 20% penalty there. So again, this is really to demonstrate that no one option is perfect. And if you want to use this with clients or individuals, we can give you the follow-up materials to do so. Now, since employer-sponsored plans and pre-tax and Roth contributions have been around for quite some time, and HSAs were only legislated into existence by President Bush on December 8, 2003, let's focus a little bit more on some of the usage scenarios and demographic profiles that might be appropriate for HSAs. And before we do that, we just want to take a look. These things are becoming popular and only growing in popularity. This is employer adoption of consumer-driven health plans over the past couple years at different size of employers. Now you can see even in the small market, by the end of next year, 34% of employers under 500 lives plan to offer a consumer-driven health plan. And so if you're working with a small business and they offer a consumer-driven health plan or a high deductible plan with an HSA, I mean, that could give them a competitive advantage. If you want to talk about reframing an employee benefits marketing strategy and trying to increase your recruitment and retention around emerging executives or young millennials with coming out of school, I mean, that is a great marketing strategy, I would say, for a small business, because it gives them a competitive advantage of essentially over 2/3 of their competitors. But at any rate, the employer adoption across the board, whether it's jumbo, large, or small employers, is only increasing with respect to HSAs. Now, the one thing I do want to point out here, we've used the phrase consumer-driven health plan and high deductible health plan, and some people use that interchangeably, but I want to make sure there is a differentiation. A consumer-driven health plan, a CDHP, is any health insurance plan that has an employee savings kind of sidecar with it. And that could be a health reimbursement account, it could be a flexible spending account, or if the plan qualifies as a high deductible plan, it comes with an HSA, it comes with a health savings account. So all of high deductible health plans are considered consumer driven. Not all consumer driven health plans have an HSA component. So in a very elementary analogy, I liken it to the relationship between a square and a rectangle. All squares are rectangles, not all rectangles are squares. That's the employer adoption of consumer-driven plans there. And here are the assets across individual account types. There are about 24 million HSA individual account holders in the United States today. And you can see the assets expected to go to $54 billion by the end of this year, and we are on pace to meet that. And it's expected to increase next year as well. So we definitely at an employer and employee level, these things are only becoming more popular. Now, we're going to look at really quick, before I move on, the media has a tendency to paint these HSAs in the best light ever. In fact, that they are the silver bullet. They are the best thing that's happened in the insurance world since sliced bread. But contrary to what the media will have you believe, there are ways that individuals can misuse HSAs. And this goes back to my earlier point that they may not be appropriate for everybody. And so what we want to walk you through here are 6 different usage scenarios, from the very bad all the way up to the very best optimal usage strategy for an HSA. And we're going to start with the very bad and work our way up. The very bad way is if you put money into an HSA and you take it out before age 65 for non-qualified medical expenses. At that point, the money is seen as earned income. You're paying a 20% penalty on it. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, for the love of Pete, don't use an HSA in lieu of an emergency preparedness account. Save a little bit for a rainy day or an emergency before putting money into an HSA. Now, the suboptimal way is if you actually, there is such a thing, is if you oversave in an HSA. And when the money goes to a non-spousal beneficiary, unlike Roth contributions at that point, it's seen as ordinary income tax. So if you save, let's say, $900,000 in an HSA, you pass away, you leave the money to your kids, all of a sudden they're gifted with a $900,000 balance, which could throw them into a much higher tax bracket and have serious tax implications for them. Now, we created this presentation and we did a lot of our research with one of our senior certified financial planners, and I had an argument with him by the title of this column, because I think there are much worse things than somebody to be gifted a $900,000 HSA balance, although he, because of the tax reasons, is calling that suboptimal for the purposes of this presentation. But I would argue, listen, there are a lot worse things in life than being gifted a six-figure HSA account. So moving on to the right, the fair way of using it is if you use the money for whatever you want to after the age of the penalty, after the penalty expires. So let's say you turn 65, you retire, and you want to use the money for a boat, you take out $100,000. At that point, it's just seen as ordinary income taxes. There's no penalty associated with it. In effect, it's essentially a glorified pre-tax distribution from a 401k after age 59 and a half at that point. So you're not realizing the full triple tax benefit, which is why it's not the greatest way, but at least you're not getting hit with a penalty. Now, moving on from fair to good, better, and best. So the good way is if you put the money in, you take the money out for qualified expenses in the same year. So you don't get hit with any taxes on that money. You don't really let it grow for future years' expenses, but kind of a no harm, no foul scenario. The good news is that the majority of HSA account holders, when you look at their contribution and distribution behavior, the majority of HSA account holders in the United States today are using it as if it's in this good column. They're putting the money in tax deferred, they're taking it out tax free in the same year for qualified expenses. The better scenario is if you were able to build up a little bit of a balance in the HSA, you were able to invest that money in long-term mutual fund investments and let it grow for you for future expenses down the road. Now, this situation may dictate that you are able to pay for normal or quote unquote routine medical expenses or generic prescriptions, or let's say an annual physical with out-of-pocket money. So you build up, you're able to pay a little bit out of pocket, and that way you're able to put more money away in the HSA. You don't have to withdraw it for those reasons. At this point, it becomes a little bit of a risk management strategy long term. You can only use it for large or unusual medical expenses incurred in the future. And then moving over all the way to the best scenario is that if you maxed out the HSA for a number of years, you're socking away a ton of money, you're building up a huge balance in the investable portion of the account, and then you save that money for retirement. These people are typically on very, very solid financial footing. These people are typically maxing out or close to maxing out a defined contribution plan or another employer-sponsored plan. They're realizing the full triple tax benefit. At this point, you don't want to incur the suboptimal scenario. You don't want to die, let's say at age 65 or 66 with a 6 or 7 figure HSA balance that you're then leaving to a non-spousal beneficiary, and they've got to deal with the tax ramifications because of it. Now, having said that, everybody will have at least some qualified medical expenses at age 65 because you can fund Medicare premiums with an HSA account or with HSA money. So you will have at least some reason to start drawing down the money at age 65 because you can use it for Medicare. So those are the 6 usage scenarios that we go through, and we want to also take you through 3 demographic profiles really quick. And here's another point of differentiation, I would say, between other financial services firms that have HSA presentations is that they get really into the nitty-gritty, saying that, well, Patrick's 32, he's got 4 kids, 2 of which have chronic conditions, 2 of which are really healthy. His wife is 38, and they take you through all of these really minute details about somebody's life. And it's so funny, regardless of what the situation financially or from a health standpoint, amazingly, their situation always points to the HSA being the absolute best decision that they can make. But what we would rather do is give you rather generic profiles for demographics and then give you questions you can ask. So if somebody is faced with, should I do a traditional PPO? Should I do the high deductible plan with an HSA? What are some considerations that would sway my opinion one way or the other? And that's what we're going to do with these 3 demographic profiles. So the first one we'll take a look at is a couple with young kids, high medical expenses, and limited savings capacity. So we can check a couple boxes here. You go, the couple's probably rather young, which means they may be relatively healthy, but they have high medical expenses, which means if they're in a high deductible plan, that's a lot of out-of-pocket money up front. That's a high deductible. They have limited savings capacity, so that if they don't have an emergency reserve somewhere and they've got to dip into their HSA for non-qualified reasons, they're getting hit with taxes and a 20% penalty at that point. And so really, there's a couple really good reasons why if this person had a PPO or a high deductible plan available to them, they'd probably lean really heavily towards the traditional PPO. A lot of high upfront expected medical costs, limited savings capacity. The kids could have chronic conditions and so forth. If you look at this, compare that to this, the people on Easy Street here, which is the healthy empty nesters in a high tax bracket. So you go, they're healthy, there's no expected high medical expenses up front. They're in a high tax bracket, which means they're probably high earners. And we know that HSAs have a triple tax advantage to saving in them. And so you go, everything seems to be pointing in the direction of a high deductible plan here. They're healthy and socking as much money away as they can in the HSA. The kids are out of the house. The kids are off the payroll. And so this really points to choosing the high deductible plan with the HSA. And then the last one we'll look at here is a healthy, successful young person with savings capacity. And this is where you just change a variable or two and you might come to a different conclusion. So you say, okay, they're young, they're healthy, successful. All of those things are pointing towards a high deductible plan with an HSA. And this is where you knowing the situation and knowing the individual would come into play. So you could say, well, if they're going back to school to get their MBA, are they going to law school? Are they going to medical school? In other words, do they have a lot of competing financial priorities that might take precedence over maxing out an HSA? But given the fact that they're healthy, they're successful, so they've got high earning capacity, and they probably have emergency funds, you say the high deductible plan makes sense for them. And then depending on their competing financial priorities, that will probably determine the level at which they save in the HSA. So let's move on here to where do you fit in this conversation? You are not a healthcare expert, nor do you want to be one. However, the issue that we keep coming back to it's several things. A lot of folks will look at the HSA market and they look at this statistic and they say, I'm not touching HSAs with a 10-foot pole. They go, there's no money in it. If you take all the contributions across those 25 million accounts and subtract out the withdrawals during the current year for medical expenses, this is what you're left with. $5-6 billion across all of those accounts. You say there's really no AUM in here. There's really no money to be had in the HSA market. And this is where we're going to bring back the statistic that 75% of plan sponsors view HSAs as a critical part of their organization's retirement benefit strategy. Now that data point was actually sourced from the Plan Sponsor Council of America, which by definition is a not-for-profit trade association dedicated to helping people who run employer-sponsored retirement plans. So you have to think, if the PSCA is all of a sudden doing HSA research and doing studies on plan sponsors as to what they think about HSAs, and not only do they feel that the topic is compelling enough to do that, but when they ask sponsors, what do you think about HSAs? And 75% of them said, we got to think about this with a retirement lens on. I have a feeling that sooner or later, advisors that work with plan sponsors are going to get asked about HSAs and how that dovetails with a 401k or with a defined contribution plan. And a lot of advisors are sitting right here. A lot of advisors are going, I'm not a healthcare expert, nor do I want to be one. There's no money in it. I can't figure out how to get paid on it. And I think that is a huge opportunity for advisors that say, you know what, my plan sponsors are going to ask me about this sooner or later. So at least being credible and conversant in healthcare savings options or the basics of HSAs, that feels like a good way to add value. It feels like a good way to deepen the relationship. And it feels like a good way to start participating in conversations that my clients are going to have, quite frankly, with or without me. And that's really the two routes that advisors and other retirement providers are taking. And if you're looking to stand out from your competitors, if you're looking to to increase retention and referrals. I think that being knowledgeable about HSAs and at least the basics is a great point of differentiation. And if you've ever been in a situation where you're about to walk into your retirement quarterly review or annual review, and the CFO comes out of another door wringing his hands and shaking his head going, God, how are we going to mitigate these health insurance expenses? And looks at you and says, what do you know about HSAs? And you can sit there and go, I'm the retirement person. Healthcare is not my thing. I'm staying in my lane. Or you can say, well, you know what? I know that the PSCA has done research about other plan sponsors like you on HSAs. I know that Morningstar just put out a report for the first time last year about the top 10 HSA providers by AUM. And I know that the Employee Benefits Research Institute has HSA trend data that plan sponsors submit to them and they've tracked over time. That feels like it's kind of a monetization versus adding value decision. And I think even if you can't explicitly monetize the HSA opportunity, I think there is a ton of value in being able to have that conversation, or at least put your plan sponsors or small business owners on track to explore the situation further. And there's a couple ways you can do this, I think, both at the individual level and the institutional level. So an easy way, if you meet with employees, if you do employee education, and you remember that blue cell chart where we put the pre-tax versus Roth versus HSAs up against each other, and the account features down the side. I mean, if you even went over that chart with individuals and said, listen, you've got these 3 different savings vehicles available to you. Let me discuss the benefits and the relative advantages and disadvantages of each. I mean, that's adding value at an individual level with reviews of healthcare savings options and strategies. If you can talk to them about the investments they have available to them in an HSA versus a 401k, so that there may not be overlap in some of the asset classes. If you look at the asset classes represented in a typical HSA, it looks exactly like a 401k plan circa 1999, right before target dates took off. I mean, the asset classes represented are almost identical to that of a 401k. So even talking about the investments of an HSA is not that far afield from what you might already be doing already. And then we're going from the dipping your toe in on the left-hand side to the double backflip off the high dive on the right-hand side. But if that CFO comes to you and said, listen, can you help me vet HSA providers? And you say, oh man, I don't know anything about HSA providers, but you read Morningstar's report and they analyzed HSA providers on things like quality of investment, robustness of the investment menu, the investment and account holder fees that are associated to HSAs, what the participant or plan sponsor experience is like, what the digital interface is like when people try to access their accounts. You think if you're doing provider searches for your plan sponsors now, those are probably all components of your current record keeper provider searches. Fees, investments, what's the participant experience or the plan sponsor experience. So again, it feels really outside of your comfort zone, but it may not be that far afield from what you're doing already. The last thing, we'll just kind of summarize what we've got here. Healthcare expenses are very top of mind. Again, employers are trying to mitigate healthcare expenses. You've got employees seeing 6-figure price tags hung on expenses in retirement. I would say you talk to them about the different savings vehicles that they have during the accumulation phase of their careers. Again, acknowledging full well that variable annuities and insurance products, as well as something like an reverse mortgage, might be very applicable to folks to help mitigate healthcare expenses in retirement. Health savings accounts, you can't beat the triple tax advantage, but they're not appropriate for everybody who have access to them. Again, people who have chronic medical conditions have very little capacity to save. A high deductible plan may not be the best option. But there are certainly opportunities that exist here to differentiate not only at the plan sponsor or institutional level, but also at the individual level as well. And so with that, I'll turn you on. We've got some links here to some statistics. We'll certainly make all of our healthcare content available to you, and we'll pass that over to Brian and the good folks at Epic so you can access that. You can access these slides if you want to. But if you're interested in that Morningstar paper, which is listed at the bottom, the PSCA study, which is right above that, and the EBRI study, which is right above that, I would encourage you to go out there. It's all publicly available information, and it could really add value in the conversations if a plan sponsor does come to you and say, what do you know about these types of accounts? So with that being said, I'll turn it back over to Brian, and certainly open it up for questions if anybody has them.
Yep, thanks, Patrick. Feel free to enter any questions you have in the panel there, and I'll run those by Patrick today. A couple things to lead us off, Patrick. You kind of closed by talking about how advisors can position themselves in this landscape. It certainly sounds like it's still a differentiator, maybe not a money maker, but a differentiator today. Do you have any feel of, when this starts to become table stakes to even be working with a plan versus the kind of the differentiator that it is today? Do you think everyone's going to need to be doing this within the next 10 years? Or, have a pulse on that at all?
I mean, I think if you're gonna throw the window of time out to 10 years, the short answer I would say is yes. I mean, the nature of these conversations and just the way the benefits are going. I mean, right now the health insurance industry and what employees are experiencing is a lot like the switch from defined benefit or pension plans 30 years ago to 401ks. I mean, it's the onus of the responsibility, if you will, to save first for retirement, now for your own healthcare expenses, is slowly being shifted from that of the employer to the employee. So, the days of the silos when only being able to talk about retirement versus only being able to talk about healthcare, it's going to take time for those to come down. But I think just the fact that the investments across both types of accounts look really similar, I think lends itself to a lot more kind of cross opportunity there.
Okay. And kind of related to your last point on investments and CFO walking in, kind of asking an advisor to take a look at the HSA, it seems that more often than not, employers are kind of just taking the HSA that, for lack of a better word, comes with their healthcare plan that's integrated with their healthcare provider, the default, whatever. Do you see that changing where employers are starting to branch out beyond that? And are there any challenges with that, such as kind of integration of claims and claims payment for those who do need to use that money to actually pay for healthcare costs more now than later?
So, I think there's a couple layers maybe to what you asked, and I want to make sure I'm understanding what it is. But just to level set, not if an employer offers a high deductible plan, they don't have to offer an HSA to their employees. Now, 90% or 91% of employers that have a high deductible plan do offer an HSA. But the good thing, and this is a really point of difference between something like a 401k, is that if you, as an employer, offered a high deductible plan and you don't like, for whatever reason, the HSA provider that the employer offers, you can select whichever HSA provider that you want to. So
right.
That's a key point. Now, there are a lot of incentives for an employee to go with the HSA provider that the employer offers, not the most being there's payroll deduction, there's employer contributions, the ease of administration and record keeping. But I think that's the cool thing, is that if you really don't like how it's managed, the fees, the investments, something like that, and you are a very proactive, self-directed, hands-on employee with respect to benefits, you can choose whichever HSA provider you want to, as long as you're in a high deductible plan.
Yeah, and I think that story kind of lines up with how an advisor might approach a higher net worth client and be able to port that HSA out and manage it, or advise on that more easily. Certainly the masses are not selecting alternative HSA providers. So the decision that the sponsor makes on what HSA to promote, if you will, would seem to be an important one as far as what an advisor might be able to do with the general employee pool versus someone that they're willing to give individual attention to. So I think, the low-hanging fruit right now that probably doesn't have as many challenges or question marks is helping those higher net worth individuals save in HSAs as just part of the general planning that you might provide to that individual. Patrick, have you seen any best practices, technology, or otherwise that have allowed advisors to really serve the masses on this front, or has it been primarily that more one-on-one type of attention right now where folks are moving the needle?
It's been one-on-one, right, that I've seen for a couple of reasons. I think in general, again, HSAs are newer, but we spent 20 hours with advisors, many of whom were not in the retirement space over the past couple months, and we brought up this topic of healthcare savings, and there were a lot of visceral reactions when we bring that up, and it's because, again, you're cutting your teeth. Your expertise is in investments. It's in portfolio construction. It's in asset allocation. It's in financial planning. And you're talking about healthcare, which by nature is a little bit outside of that realm historically. And B, some of the verbatims we got back and the quotes we saw, it was like, how am I going to help my high net worth clients prepare for something that is so unpredictable that they might not even need, or that they might not even know they need, or even tell me that there might be a health issue at this point? It hasn't been scaled, so to speak, to a lot of folks, because I think that the reactions to it, that the comfort level, both of the advisor addressing it with the individual, because it's not a very pleasant conversation. You're asking somebody to go through an exercise to envision themselves one day gradually or rapidly declining in mental or physical health. And so it doesn't leave the individual client with the warm and fuzzies after you have that meeting. And so I think there's a level of discomfort at the advisor level, and not a lot of individuals want to go through that mental exercise either. And so it hasn't really taken hold across the board. But in the retirement space, more and more record keepers, more and more providers are starting to reach out and say, do we need to have an HSA solution in-house? If we don't, how can we partner with different HSA providers? So at the very least, when somebody logs into their retirement account, they have a link, or they've got a window, or they've got some sort of path or connection to the HSA account that they're saving. And not just to take a look at the amounts and the balances, but also to get a more holistic view of the asset allocation and portfolio across both account types. So a long-winded way of saying it, I don't think there's a strategy that's taken hold across the board with advisors and individuals. It's much more one-off because of those reasons.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good way to close it. Appreciate the time today, Patrick, and would love to hear from any of you on the phone who are interested in integrating HSAs, for example, into your practice. We're very actively talking about this at Epic Retirement Plan Services, and we'd love to hear from you on how you're thinking about it, so that you can help us shape what we end up doing in this arena. So appreciate everyone's time today, and thanks again to Patrick Delaney and Rowe Price Investment Services. We'll look forward to seeing y'all on the next webinar. Thanks.